So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing our tafsir. Really excited because we have a couple things to cover. And let's go back to some of the things that we talked about. Let's go back right there. We talked about Sahel ibn Abdullah, and we talked pretty much a lot about bid'ah. But after class, somebody asked a question about bid'ah hasana. And I thought that would be really important to go over it again, even though I answered that question, but I'm going to go over it again. So bid'ah hasana, remember when I said the first opinion, the second opinion, the first opinion were really strict on making it as text-based. The second opinion, they considered that a general comprehensive text can be also a reference to support that this path or this practice is not necessarily an innovation or a bid'ah. Remember that piece of it. But then where does that bid'ah hasana fall into all of this? So bid'ah hasana, just to summarize what I talked about yesterday, was something that was introduced at least in the in the label of it, in the definition, or at least in let's call it the technical term, that was mainly supported and introduced by a scholar named Al-Izz ibn Abd salam. Al-Izz ibn Abd salam is a Shafi'i scholar who lived during the time of al-Mamalik. So we're talking about ninth century Hijriya, 8th and ninth century Hijriya. So that's basically the time of al-Mamalik. Now, one thing is that when you speak about the term itself, bid'ah hasana, a good innovation, for the first opinion, the first group of scholars, they said that there's no such thing as a bid'ah hasana. The second group of scholars, they said, well, wait a minute, let's explain what we mean by bid'ah hasana. What we mean by bid'ah hasana, we are talking about the foundation itself is actually based on sunnah. So we're not inventing anything, but we're enhancing sunnah. The first group of scholars, they said sunnah doesn't need enhancement, it's already there. But the second group of scholars, they said, well, let me give you an example. You're talking about things like the science of tajweed. You're talking about the science of nahu. The Prophet ﷺ didn't know the science of tajweed as in the technical way that we have it now, but the technical way we have it now actually traces back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. That's how he had read the Quran. That's how he had received the Quran, and it was read in certain sounds, in certain ways of articulation, in certain lengthening, in certain combination of letters, and therefore the science of tajweed was to actually maintain that knowledge and preserve basically the main keys of how the Prophet ﷺ had read the Quran. Same thing if you're talking about nahu. All right, the Prophet ﷺ for sure did not know what a fa'al, maf'ul bihi, tamyiz, hal, all of that. Didn't have these terms at the time, but he definitely knew how to understand the Arabic and understand what these, at least these words with their, let's call it with their places of grammar and all of that. In other words, the grammar was the science that later came in order to help us understand the eloquence of the previous Arab and how they actually spoke Arabic. In other words, the science, the grammar science was actually brought in order to help understand the foundation of what they had articulated. Now, therefore, the second opinion, they would say, well, things like nahu or Arabic grammar or perhaps tajweed or perhaps microphones at the masjid, basically to make the voices louder, or maybe the lights, or maybe perhaps salat al-tarawih, where it was done by the Prophet ﷺ, not as frequently, but it was done by the Prophet ﷺ, in sense there is no harm for anybody to actually think that it was going to be obligatory. So therefore, he was basically making it clear that the reason why he wasn't consistent was in order to make sure that it does not become obligatory on all. But then, since that wasn't a worry, that wasn't a problem anymore, then therefore Umar ibn al-Khattab wanted to later make it something that was available, that was a bring in the union. In other words, this wasn't a bid'ah, but it was a bid'ah hasana, and Umar ibn al-Khattab basically practiced it in order to revive something that the Prophet ﷺ himself had done. So for the second opinion, like Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam, they said, well, what we mean by bid'ah hasana is that it traces back to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and basically enhancing it, or basically making it something that people would practice or people would basically embrace. Okay, so that's bid'ah hasana. Bid'ah hasana does not whatsoever include innovating something that the Prophet ﷺ had not done. That both scholars, whether the second group of scholars, the first group of scholars, they would say that's a bid'ah, period. The first group of scholars that we talked about earlier, would they consider the science of tajweed or nahu or microphones? Would they consider that as bid'ah? No, they would not consider it as bid'ah. So why wouldn't they just call it bid'ah hasana? They disagreed with the term, but they definitely had agreed that all of that is not bid'ah. Salat al-Tarawih is not bid'ah. Microphones at the masjid are not bid'ah. Tajweed is not a bid'ah. Nahu is not a bid'ah. So even the first group of scholars, they just disagreed with the term and considered it as an oxymoron. That it's an oxymoron. You can't be bid'ah and a hasana, because if you say bid'ah, they consider that means an innovation, and by definition, bid'ah, al-bid'ah is كل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. They said there's every single bid'ah is a deviation, and every single deviation is in hellfire. So to somehow say bid'ah hasana, they regarded it as, you can't say a good bid'ah because every bid'ah is an innovation. Every innovation is a deviation. So how can you say innovation, a good innovation? Because they consider that that's more of an oxymoron, and therefore they disagreed with the term, but they definitely agreed with the details that those are actually good within our society to teach basically the basics of nahu, or teach nahu, or teach lugha Arabiya, or teach sarf, or teach tajweed, or any of that basically that we had talked about. They did not consider it a bid'ah. So it's basically, I guess, just a term. Okay, let's continue right there. قال أبو العالي عليكم بالأمر الأول الذي كانوا عليه قبل أن يفترقوا. This is key. He said, keep or maintain or stay connected and consistent with the first matter before they had become, I guess, in different groups. But here's one thing. When you say before they had become into different groups, I'm going to actually get to this one. دعاة على أبواب جهنم. I want you to look at this hadith. Now, of course, yesterday we talked about the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, تفترق أمتي. Let me take that hadith out there and just put it right there. Yarhamkumullah. Okay, and I'm going to write it down. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's put that right there. I want you to see it. Okay, and افترقت اليهود. This is the hadith. Okay, let's see. افترقت اليهود على 71 فرقة، وافترقت النصارى على 72 فرقة، وستفترق هذه الأمة على 73 فرقة، كلها في النار إلا واحدة. قيل من هي يا رسول الله؟ فقال صلى الله عليه وسلم من كان على مثل ما أنا عليه وأصحابي. Now, of course, you would say that the takhrij, he said, لم نقف عليه مسندا. What does the hadith mean? And what does that quote mean itself? Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ had said that the Jews had been divided to 71 different groups. whether you're talking about a cult, divisions, different groups in terms of creed, in terms of practice, spiritual practice, legislature, whatever it is, all each and every single one was considered a certain sect. Okay. وافترقت النصارى على 72 فرقة. The Christians, they were divided to 72 different sects. And this nation, that is the Muslim nation, would divide into 73 different nations. They're all in hellfire except one. And then he was told, which one is that? And he responded, what I and my companions are practicing today. Okay. This is a very scary hadith. But the question is this hadith necessarily valid? So scholars actually had differences of opinions on this hadith, and specifically this portion of the hadith. This portion of the hadith is the most controversial. What does it say? All of them are in hellfire except one. Now, this piece of it is the most controversial, and in fact, the whole hadith is probably the most controversial hadith for a number of different reasons. Number one, you look at the chain of narration. There were a number of different chain of narrations, and the chain of narrations were not all, or at least were not authentic thoroughly. They all had some debate on them. This particular portion of the hadith, they're all in hellfire except one, is even more controversial than the rest of the portion of the hadith for a number of different reasons. Number one is for chain of narration reasons. Number two is, even if we are to suppose that that this basically would mean that yes, it is part of the hadith, then they had differences of opinions. Are we talking about kulluha, this pronoun ha right there, meaning all of them are in hellfire except one? Is all of them, is them referring to the Jews and the Christians? Or is them referring to the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims except one? Okay, then they had differences of opinions. Well, who is that one? Are we talking about the people of Hadith? Are we talking about some group that will be doing jihad for the sake of Islam? Or is that the scholars, and they would be the ones to basically connect with what the Prophet ﷺ was basically teaching and what he was living based on? In other words, the ones that are committed to Quran and Sunnah. Is that what it means? So that's one thing that I would like to connect, just to help us understand that yes, there's a lot of controversy in this hadith. That doesn't mean we cancel it out thoroughly, because there's another hadith I would say that is crucial to understand along with this hadith. Let's look at this hadith. روى البخاري في صحيح بسنده إلى حذيفة بن اليمان. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, Bukhari narrated in his Sahih. In other words, this hadith is actually authentic. Now, this is key to know. This hadith is authentic. In other words, it's not something that we probably would think that, yes, there are differences of opinions. No, this is an authentic hadith. Makes things easier for us instead of trying to say, okay, what do scholars actually say in regards to a chain of narration? Okay, let's see. And he said, كان الناس يسألون رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الخير وكنت أسأله عن الشر مخافة أن يدركني فقلت يا رسول الله إنا كنا في جاهلية وشر فجاءنا الله بهذا الخير فهل بعد هذا الخير من شر؟ قال نعم. قلت وهل بعد ذلك الشر من خير؟ قال نعم وفيه دخن. قلت وما دخنه؟ قال قوم يهدون بغير هدي تعرف منهم وتنكر. قلت فهل بعد ذلك الخير من شر؟ قال نعم دعاة على أبواب جهنم من أجابهم إليها قذفوه فيها. قلت يا رسول الله صفهم لنا. قال هم من جلدتنا ويتكلمون بألسنتنا. قلت فما تأمرني إن أدركني ذلك؟ قال تلزم جماعة المسلمين وإمامهم. قلت فإن لم يكن لهم جماعة ولا إمام؟ قال فاعتزل تلك الفرق كلها ولو أن تعض بأصل شجرة حتى يدركك الموت وأنت على ذلك. Pretty straightforward hadith. Let me translate it first. So Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman was the Sahabi, and he said everyone used to ask the Prophet ﷺ about the pious actions and what is good, but I used to ask about evil things because I did not want to basically be within its perimeter and not know. So I asked the Prophet ﷺ, and I said, O Prophet of Allah, we were living in a jahiliyyah. In other words, living in a time of delusion, living in a time of deviation, and washar, and it was evil. And then Allah brought us all this good. Yet, is there going to be evil coming after this good that was basically now revealed to us? Now it's clear, it's manifest in all different corners. The Prophet ﷺ said, yes. And then he said, that is Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, is there evil after this good? And he said, yes, but there is in it dakhan. I want you to look at this word dakhan right there, because the word dakhan can mean fog, can also mean smoke. So if you're talking about smoke, you're talking about, of course, things are going to become murky at the end. There's going to be stains at the end. But if you're talking about fog, you're talking about that once this goes away, that things are going to be clear again because it's just basically water. Okay. But if you're talking about smoke, no, after this smoke goes away, then all of the smoke basically turns into all of that black, that black stuff that basically then would cover everything. But the word dakhan, the Prophet ﷺ had then, explained when Hudhayfa ibn Yaman said, well, وَمَا دَخَنْهُ? It's like, what is that dakhan that's within it? And then he said, قَالَ قَوْمٌ يَهْدُونَ بِغَيْرِ هَدْيِ. They would be people making yahduna. They would be guiding people. They would be preaching to people. But this preaching, these classes, بِغَيْرِ هَدْيِ, they're not based on the guidance in the preaching that the Prophet ﷺ had given. تعرف منهم وتنكر. You may know some of it, may not know the truth of this matter and what lies behind it, but they're, you could see right there, they're speaking of Quran Sunnah, they might be speaking of a hadith, they might be speaking of ayat, but the truth of the matter, it's camouflaged. So that's the word dakhan. It's camouflage containing some ilm and some not. It's camouflaged containing something that is very murky and you wouldn't be capable of differentiating what is actually good and what is evil. Now, remember, because Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, the whole context was he was asking about good and evil. So therefore, the Prophet ﷺ was letting us know that there's going to come a time that even those du'at, even those teachers, they may not even teach based on what the Prophet ﷺ was teaching, but they were actually teaching not what the Prophet ﷺ was teaching. They were camouflaging a lot of fitna, a lot of what the Prophet ﷺ was warning against, but they were teaching it as if it is an interpretation, as if it is a way of guidance. Let's see. And then he said, is there good after that evil? And he said, yes. There are going to be du'atun ala abwabi jahannam. There are going to be these people that would be the word du'at. Du'at does not necessarily mean a preacher, but it can be that it's a person that is standing at a door of hellfire. So here they are. They're standing at a door of hellfire. This du'a or this da'iyah, he could be a da'iyah in Islam. He could be a da'iyah perhaps that may look Muslim, or a da'iyah that may be a feminist, or a da'iyah that may be, I don't know, an atheist, a da'iyah. And each one is going to be just like in the other hadith that we did before, that there, or actually it was an athar, that there would be these knights that would be standing. And of course, they're going to have great eloquence. They're going to be capable of giving you a good argument. They're definitely going to be, seeming that they are well educated, very well articulate, that they basically are doing a great job. And here's the thing, is that you as a person think of it, you're thinking of it as a booth. You're going to this booth, you're going to that booth, you're listening to this person, you're listening to the other person, but then what? Without you realizing that this door or that booth behind it and what you would be applying for is perhaps maybe hellfire itself. What made you apply for that person? Well, he seemed like he was answering my questions beautifully. He seemed, or she seemed, that they were doing a good job in being articulate, and they did a good job in marketing their product as if it was going to make us happier, live longer, live basically in a stable life and all of that. And that's the truth of the matter, is that they're دعاة على أبواب جهنم من أجابهم إليها قذفوه فيها. You respond it, you take it, you accept it. It's basically hellfire. You'll be thrown in it. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So he said, O Prophet of Allah, describe them to us. He said, هم من جلدتنا. They actually are from our skin, and they would speak in our language. Here's the thing. When you say from our skin, are we talking about Arab? Perhaps. Are we talking about Muslim? Perhaps. Are we talking about speaking in the same rhetoric that we may be speaking in? Yes, perhaps. So all of that is actually included, that they would be called Muhammad, Ahmad, and they would have Muslim names. They would be part of the Ummah. They would come in the masajid. They would pray with us. They would actually be probably wearing hijab, maybe niqab if you may. All of that, it's basically possible. Because if you say hum min jildatina, that actually means they're the same skin. In other words, we're not talking about some kind of Chinese Muslim here. We're not talking about some kind of somebody that is, a completely different. No, no, he's probably even, the same skin, the same ancestry, the same, from your own people as a Muslim. This isn't some strange person. Nope, they're just like you. What did he want to say? It wasn't like Ya'juj and Ma'juj that they were a completely different race. But this is hum min jildatina, same skin, same people. It's not something coming from outer space. Same people. يتكلمون بألسنتنا. They speak in the same rhetoric, the same tongue, same everything. You're able to understand it, and it's completely clear, and it's not necessarily a different language. It's something that you can understand. قلت فما تأمرني إن أدركني ذلك. He said, what would you order me if I lived long enough to see that? He said, تلزم جماعة المسلمين وإمامهم. He said, you would hold on, you would stick, you would basically get yourself belonged with the Muslimin and even their imam. Wait a minute. When you say جماعة المسلمين, what does that even mean? The majority of the Muslims? Yes, that's one piece of it. Majority of the Muslims. But imamahum is also important, because this is telling you that you really have to take a scholar to be your mentor. A scholar, what should be? I mean, how do I know that this isn't one of these scholars? How do I know that I'm not confusing myself? Now, that's why you would have to do some of your homework to make sure that this is a qualified scholar, and that they would go back to the resources of Quran and Sunnah and not give you some rhetoric of what makes you feel good, motivational speaking. You would basically stand your ground and do your homework. And that's why he said, قلت فإن لم يكن لهم جماعة ولا إمام. He said, what if they didn't have a group there was no group that I could say, and what if there was no imam either, no scholar? So the Prophet ﷺ said, فَاعْتَزِلْ تِلْكَ الْفِرْقَ كُلَّهَا وَلَوْ أَنْ تَعَضَّ بِأَصْلِ شَجَرَةٍ. He said, well then, avoid all those sects, even if you would actually bite on the root of a tree. Wait a minute. So is this like, what do you mean bite on a root of a tree? Literally take a tree and root? No, 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 no. This isn't talking about that. This is talking about the basis. So remember the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually had given the example of La ilaha illallah. That it is كَشَجَرَةٍ طَيِّبَةٍ أَصْلُهَا ثَابِتٌ وَفَرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. That's Tawheed. Okay, that's Tawheed. So when he was giving him that example, that was to let him know, go back to the resources themselves. And the way that you would bite onto the basis of something, you hold on to it. That's the same thing that you would want to do, whether it's memorizing Quran, whether it's learning the Sunnah, going back to these resources. That's the first thing that you would want to do, even if you didn't have a social supporting group. That's one thing I would tell a lot of the reverts, especially when they would say, I would feel isolated, I don't have family, etc. And we would say, remember, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam didn't have family. Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, his family, basically his own son, his own wife were basically against him. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, his own father basically threw him in the fire. All right. Now, when you look at all that, just remember that throughout history, we had many examples of even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioning that man, وَجَاءَ رَجُلٌ مِّنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْعَى قَالَ يَا قَوْمِ اتَّبِعُوا الْمُرْسَلِينَ. It was a man basically saying, coming from afar, and he was basically telling the people, من أقصى المدينة, from a far city, يسعى, he was scurrying and rushing. قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين. He was saying, oh people, follow al-mursalin. The ayat were mentioning him. Did they mention the name? It didn't mention the name. But obviously, he was a lone man. That's why even in Surah Al-Haqqa, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فيقول يا ليت هاؤم اقرءوا كتابي إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابي فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية. What do they say? كلوا واشربوا هنيئا بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية. Let's reread these ayat. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَمَّا, and as for those that would get their book in their right hand, فَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ فَيَقُولُ هَاؤُمُ اقْرَءُوا كِتَابِيَهْ. Speaking in an excited tone, هَاؤُمُ اقْرَءُوا كِتَابِيَهْ. Come and read, look at the book that I had already filled with all these pious actions and all these pious records and all these good deeds. He's basically just boasting about how his book is filled with all these good deeds that he'll be rewarded for and that he'll be getting Jannah for. ها قرأوا كتابي إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابيه. I knew, though the word ظننت, it wasn't, I thought, but it was that he was really in full belief that he was going to be held accountable, that this was going to be something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was for sure going to either reward or punish or even bring the day of judgment. إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابي فهو في عيشة راضية. That's when they're going to be in a life of delight. فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية. In a high Jannah. Why is it a high place in Jannah? في جنة عالية. In a high place in Jannah beyond all. Of course, even if you are to rent a place, when you rent up the upper floors, it's a different price than the bottom floors. When you go up, you get to see a different view. You get to see a lot of things. فهو في جنة عالية. Or is it في جنة عالية Is it going to be a different temperature? Is it going to be a different nature? Is the Jannah aliyah? Is it different floors? Is it different privileges? What really is on the top floor compared to the bottom to compared to etc. Anyhow, في جنة عالية قطوفها دانية. Its own fruits are near. قطوفها. القطوف are basically the fruits. دانية, really close. قطوفها دانية. But here's one thing. كلوا واشربوا هنيئا. Eat, eat and drink in delight. And the word هنيئة actually means that they're doing it, that is the eating and drinking, not for the sake of hunger, but it's just for the sake of just joy. Yeah, they're just eating and drinking, not because they're hungry, but it's just for the sake of, just having fun. Just feel like when you would get dessert, you're not hungry, but it's just an extra thing that makes you feel good. Okay. كلوا واشربوا هنيئا, but here's the key word. بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية. For what you had done on those days that were khaliyah, those days that were empty days, when you had no friends, when you had no supporters, when you had no one to basically encourage you to do this, you had no supporters of probably family, of probably friends, or anyone. You were basically in a place when you wanted to perhaps wear your hijab. They mocked you for your hijab and thought it was too traditional, making you look ugly, making your face look fat, making you look big, making your head appear like I don't know what it is, and all of these different things, or calling your hijab, I don't know, I don't know, a towel head or whatever it is, all these different things. You didn't care about that. They're ayyam khaliya. And perhaps your family or your friends abandoned you because they thought you were too extreme. They thought you were speaking like an old person, like an old lady. You were too boring, etc. That's ayyam khaliya. No one wants to be your friend. No one wants to basically associate with you. You're no fun to them. That's ayyam khaliya. Or even your own family abandoning you because they would feel that you're a disgrace to them for holding on to your Islam, etc. All of that. Those are ayyam al-khaliyah. Those are the days of al-ayyam al-khaliyah. That's the same thing right there. فَاعْتَزِلْ. Leave all those firaq. Leave all those sects, leave all those divisions, but what you're holding on to is بِأَصْلِ شَجَرَةٍ. It's like you're holding on, fighting hard. بأصل شجرة. What is بأصل شجرة? Like the root, the basis of that tree. What tree? It's like شجرة طيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء. It's basically لا إله إلا الله. It's basically going back to those resources. Even if that's the only thing that you have, just go back to it. حتى يدركك الموت. Until you meet your final destiny, which is death. وأنت على ذلك. And that you would be basically holding on to that resource, even if you had no one to support you, even if you were alone. You be the leader that you would wish to see. You be the leader that you hold on to the truth, even if you did not have any supporters, even if you did not have anyone to be with you. Now, that's exactly what Abu Ali was talking about. He said, "Alaykum bil amr al-awwal." Stick on to the first matter. What first matter? Basically, the first matter, the root of Islam itself. Basically, what the Prophet ﷺ was teaching before they went into all these divisions. What divisions? Whether the divisions of the time back then, what they would call Mu'tazila or Ash'ara or whatever. Well, I mean, Ash'ara would get angry at me, okay? Or maybe Mu'tazila and Jahmiya and all of these different things, okay? But at the end, of course, even Ash'ara would consider themselves that they're actually within this. But anyhow, all right. Let's see. And I'm gonna skip right there. And let's see. وقد okay. And right there, تفرقت بنو إسرائيل, we just talked about this one. So I'm going to skip that one. And let's see, what did he say in number 4? Okay, I'm going to skip that one. Some of the scholars, I want you to look at this one. قال بعض العلماء العارفين هذه الفرقة التي زادت في فرق أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم هم قوم يبغضون العلماء ويعادون الفقهاء. I want you to look at this one because this is becoming very common. I want you to look at this one. Some العلماء العارفين. When you say العارفين, العارف is basically the person that is the knowledgeable person. But this isn't talking about any knowledge. This isn't talking about that, yeah, I've got a PhD or I've got, I don't know, a master's or whatever it is. This isn't talking about that because those kind of degrees, they considered them as, okay, so you passed this. But no, we're talking about a person that went beyond the knowledge into making that knowledge a practice that they would hold on to in their life. It became a mindset. It became a practice. It became an identity. That's al-alim al-arif. العالم العارف is not a person that learned the ilm, but is a person that embraced it to the point that it is their identity. That you cannot separate them from that identity because it is what makes them. They live Islam and that's who they are. They are Islam. They are basically the ones to be in defense where if you did not basically, let's, take an example. You were to take Ibn Taymiyyah, for example. Okay. Ibn Taymiyyah, all you would know about Ibn Taymiyyah is not his personal life, him not getting married and him living in Syria and him being from this and that city. Now, that wasn't the most important thing about him. What really makes Ibn Taymiyyah stand out is his strong defense in living Islam and basically teaching it and wanting to defend Islam, even though his own personal life was definitely taken away, where he even preferred being imprisoned over living his own life and getting married and all of that. He never even got married. He said, no one reminded me of that. All right. So now you would see certain figures. They would live the religion, and there's no other way to know them but by all the legacy that they had left behind. Now, let's continue with this one. العلماء العارفين, they said that these different groups, these different sects, are basically the sects that would add things upon what the Prophet ﷺ had come with. In other words, what did they do? What would they look like? He said, قَوْمٌ يُبْغِضُونَ الْعُلَمَاء. They would be people that despise and they would hate the scholars, and they would also be an enemy to the scholars of fiqh. Why did you exclude scholars of fiqh than scholars of hadith or all of that? So the word al-fuqaha does not, in this sentence, does not necessarily mean only scholars that are specialized in Islamic legislature. But this is a comprehensive word to mean the scholars that know Islam from its resources. So when they see the scholars, they would consider that, those are boring. I'm looking for something different. And then they would start attacking the scholars. And here's one thing. Ibn Asakir used to say, لُحُومُ الْعُلَمَاءِ مَسْمُومَةً. It's not a hadith, but he said that the flesh of scholars is masmoom. It is full of venom. Wait a minute. How is that supposed to be praising them? No, let me explain. That's basically to say that if you would backbite that scholar, what would come back in return is that you bit the scholar, but you ended up poisoning yourself. That's what it means. You ended up poisoning yourself the second that you started gossiping against that scholar. You thought that by gossiping about this or that scholar, that somehow that made you think of yourself as being better, and somehow you are more advanced, or somehow you are at a better place. But the truth of the matter is that you just poisoned yourself. You poisoned your heart with the envy that basically had gone wrong, with the fitna that it basically is going to later get into your bloodstream, and then you're going to get sick. What kind of sickness? We're not talking about cancer. We're not talking about bronchitis or whatever it is, but we're talking about getting sick in the heart. Because when you take the alim that is arif, the alim that is applying ilm into action, you take them as the mentor, as you take them as your as the person to help you learn the resources and basically guide you, then that's going to be your key to helping you find the right path, because you may not be qualified to look for those resources, but this alim, they will have those keys to help you know the resources, to help you know where you should be going, to help you know that this is something that is a red flag, you got to keep away, or etc. That's why it's important to revive some of that Sufism that at one point actually brought Islam to the world. Yes, Sufism at one point is what brought Islam to the world. In fact, there are many areas. They didn't have Islamic universities. They didn't have Islamic institutions, no seminars, no none of that, nothing. In many places in Africa, and many places and all over Asia, it was really those that wanted to live the commitment away from dunya. They would be the ones to sacrifice every single title in this dunya and live on scraps of foods or scraps of different things in life and give away on dunya, because they wanted to basically be Sufi, wanted to be away from dunya, and they would basically separate themselves away from all this dunya, and they would be in these, the ones to give da'wah in these remote cities in Africa, very remote cities. How did they go that far? It was on the shoulders and basically those that wanted to live the commitment, and many of them were actually the Sufis. So before we start criticizing a lot of that Sufism, perhaps in Africa, and criticize in Asia and etc., maybe we should at least appreciate that they had managed to get Islam to these people. It's so easy to criticize, but if you would like to bring an alternative, and before you go and criticize the innovation, go ahead and teach the Sunnah. Go ahead and teach Tawheed. Show me what you can do. Show me how you can, instead of turning off the candle and say, no, we need to eliminate all that, you know what? Why don't you turn another one on instead? Go ahead. Because guess what? A lot of these Sufi groups that were out there in Africa, they were the ones to face the colonial missionaries that were basically providing these people with all of these different things in order to Christianize them. But it was a lot of the Sufi efforts that were teaching and doing all of that in keeping people consistent, in keeping people connected to their Islam. So when I want to talk about يبغضون العلماء ويعادون الفقهاء, I'm talking about even these people that had the ilm, You know, it's so easy to criticize, but bring something instead. And bring something instead and bring that alternative to the ummah, and that's what's going to basically really bring about that ilm and that enlightenment, if you basically find the right scholars to learn from. If you find these right scholars, and even if they may have their shortcomings, do not rush in criticizing them. Do not rush in criticizing them, because they're human beings at the end of the day, and they're not infallible. So therefore, knowing which ulama to listen to and knowing which resources, that's the hardest thing to find. Once you find these resources, they'll have their shortcomings. Don't rush in criticizing these scholars, because at the end of the day, they are human beings. They're not prophets. They'll have their shortcomings. But remember, لحوم العلماء مسمومة, just like Ibn Asakir had said, that it's going to come back to you and it's going to poison you once you talk about that or this scholar in that way. Right now, what we're seeing is that many people, many people, criticizing different scholars and thinking that somehow it feeds their ego and makes them look better, or makes them appear that they were critical thinkers and they know exactly how to go beyond even these scholars, and that it feeds their ego. And that's why he said, لحوم العلماء مسمومة. It feeds their ego, and it's so easy to criticize and make yourself feel good that, hey, I managed to go beyond this person, even though, yeah, he's such a big deal within the society. Everybody's listening to him, but you know what? I'm even better. It's so easy to do that. But remember, لحوم العلماء مسمومة. Okay, let's see. This hadith, يكون في أمتي قوم يكفرون بالله وبالقرآن وهم لا يشعرون. Let's see, what is this? كما كفرت اليهود والنصارى. He said that there's going to be a time that, hold on, let's first look at this hadith. Here we go. ذكر الحديث. This is number 1. We're going to go but right there. You know what? Maybe I shouldn't tell you the secret to it. Okay, let me first say the hadith and what it says. يكون في أمتي قوم يكفرون بالله وبالقرآن وهم لا يشعرون. There would be in my ummah, in my nation, a group of people. They would deny Allah and deny the Quran, and they won't even feel it. Exactly the way that the Jews and the Christians had done. So I said, جعلت فداك يا رسول الله. I would جعلت فداك يا رسول الله. It's a way to say, I would be giving my life for your sake, O Prophet of Allah. It's like, you are more important than me. It's a way of showing honor. Okay. He said, how is that going to happen? That they would be part of our ummah, but then they would deny Allah? How is that even possible? And he said, يُقِرُّونَ بِبَعْضٍ وَيَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْضٍ. They would believe in some and object to others. They would believe in the Quran, but when it comes to, for example, the ayah about polygamy, it's like, I don't believe in that. Or I disagree with this point. Or when it comes to perhaps maybe an ayah that is related to maybe how shaitan will use people changing their appearance and fillers and all of these different things as a method to control their hearts. They'll be basically, I'm not ready to practice that yet. يقرون ببعض. They would believe in some of it, but then the others they would abandon. قلت جعلت فداك يا رسول الله وكيف يقولون. He said again, he said the same thing. O Prophet of Allah, my life would be for your sake. I would give my life for your sake. What would they say? He said, يجعلون إبليسا عدلا لله. He said they would make Iblis as basically the counter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his creation, or even in his power, or even in the provisions. وَيَقُولُونَ الْخَيْرُ مِنَ اللَّهِ وَالشَّرُّ مِنْ إِبْلِيسِ. And they would say, what is good is coming from Allah, and what is evil is coming from Iblis. قال فيكفرون بالله. And he said, so then they would deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ثم يقرؤون على ذلك كتاب الله. And then they would even be quoting from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever supports their selected interpretations, and then فيكفرون بالقرآن بعد الإيمان والمعرفة. And then they would basically deny the Quran after they had embraced faith and even had some knowledge. قال فما تلقى أمتي منهم من العداوة والبغضاء والجدال أولئك زنادقة هذه الأمة. Said, and what you would say from the ummah, basically from these people, they would be the ones to bring animosity, to bring hate, to bring all those arguments. Those are the zanadiqa of this ummah. The zanadiqa meaning the ones that are deviant from this nation. Okay, a couple things to say about this hadith right there. It sounds, very, what words can I use? Definitely describing today when you look at it. But before we even scrutinize this hadith and scrutinize its words, the question is that an authentic hadith? Let's go back right there. We're going to go, of course, they had done, basically the scholars that reviewed this book, they basically had done the job for us. And he said, well, it was actually mentioned in الضعفاء وفي إسناده عطية ابن أبي عطية. In the chain of narration, there's a narrator that we basically do not know as an anonymous narrator. And أتى بخبر موضوع, الذهبي said. الذهبي also said that this Atiyah ibn Abi Atiyah guy, he basically one time narrated a fabricated hadith. Okay. So what does that mean? Does that mean that this hadith is not authentic? Yes, it definitely tells us that this hadith is not authentic, but definitely it's quite interesting to look into this hadith. It's not a fabricated hadith per se. We don't have these scholars basically saying that this is necessarily fabricated, but one of the chain of narrators basically has that history, but that doesn't make that this hadith is necessarily an authentic hadith. But the meanings themselves, or what he's talking about, that they would be denying Allah, but they don't even yet feel it, they deny the Quran, etc. So even if I don't necessarily quote this hadith and say that it is authentic, it doesn't necessarily mean that other ahadith do not give a similar meaning. We do have authentic ahadith that tell me that this was going to be a case in the ummah. People leaving some of the Quran, people being part of the ummah, people basically denying parts of the ayat, parts of the ahadith, or saying that they would be just like this hadith, that it's about time that a man would be sitting on his couch or ala arikatihi, and he would say, whatever is in the Quran we'll take, and whatever is in the hadith, we're not going to take that. We're going to reject it because we're not sure of how valid this information is. So the Prophet ﷺ had basically talked about this person that would, in terms of reference, abandon some and embrace others. So we do have other ayat or other hadith that also spoke of تؤمنون ببعض ويكفرون بالبعض فما جزاء من يفعل ذلك منكم إلا خزي في الحياة الدنيا, etc. Okay, so we do have other ayat that give the same inference. Those that would basically believe in the Quran or believe in Islam and leave the rest, and the ayat were basically were exposing these kind of behaviors and actions. So even if this hadith is not authentic, this doesn't mean the information in it is not supported by other evidences from Quran and Sunnah. In other words, yes, we do have this being something that is happening even during our time today. They would believe in Quran, they might call themselves Muslim, but the practice the practice, whether in their aqidah or whether in their behavior, is definitely going the wrong direction. Let's see right there. And we did talk about this in Surah An-Nisa in regards to sitting and surrounding ourselves with the people of al-bid'ah wal-ahwa. Let me just explain this one. When we're talking about surrounding ourselves with these types of people, what does that mean? What do you mean surrounding ourselves with these? Like, what do you mean? Like around and whether? The Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned in the hadith, لا يأكل طعامك إلا مؤمن. Only eat with a mu'min. That you would only eat or you would only drink with a believer, and you would live only with a taqi. This is, hold on. That the Prophet ﷺ basically said, لا تصاحب إلا مؤمنا ولا يأكل طعامك إلا تقي. Now, this is very important to keep in mind. Let me take you to that hadith. Okay, here's the hadith. لا تصاحب إلا مؤمنا ولا يأكل طعامك إلا تقي. You could see this hadith is a Hasan hadith. What does it mean, a Hasan hadith? So it's really near an authentic hadith. What's the difference? The difference between the level of Sahih and the level of Hasan and the level of Daif. Hold on, I'm going to write it down for you in order to help you basically understand those. Okay, here we go. So الحديث الصحيح, I'm going to write it down. ما اتصل إسناده, I'm going to write it down, بنقل العدل الضابط عن العدل الضابط إلى منتهاه من غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. Let me explain it. So, an authentic hadith basically has a connected chain of narration, and this chain of narration, every narrator is adl, and every single narrator in the chain of narration is basically an authentic person in, one, their piety, two, their ability to basically understand and basically to word the hadith. That's a dabat. That wording. We would test and we would compare the different narrations, and then we would see which one of these narrators has a habit of not giving the right wording. In other words, the exact wording of what was actually said. We're going to go through the whole chain of narration to make sure of two things: the piety and the ilm. In other words, basically to be able to pass on the exact wording from the beginning to the very end without being basically different or even having a problem in their referencing, or even a problem in their quotation, or even disagree with those, or perhaps maybe not mention the ahadith with the authentic narration as the ones to have a better narration, better ilm, etc., then we would look into it. Now, a hadith that is Hasan has a problem right there. The problem is in the word al-Dabit, the one that their words are not always the most accurate in their quotation. So, لا تصاحب إلا مؤمنا. The Prophet ﷺ said, only be friends with a believer. What is al-musahaba? Al-musahaba, they would eat with you. Whenever you want to hang out, they would be the ones you would hang out with. Al-musahaba, they would spend time with you. You would basically put efforts together. You have a certain mission. You basically walk together. You talk together. That's al-musahaba. That's The Prophet ﷺ said, إِلَّا مُؤْمِنًا, only be friends with a believer. وَلَا يَأْكُلْ طَعَامَكَ إِلَّا تَقِي, and only a person that has the taqwa, you would eat with them. Does that mean just random moments? No, this is actually telling you as a confirmation that when we're talking about being friends with somebody, whether you're eating with them or whether you're, just having all these different good times together, make sure that you are very selective in who you're actually taking and making friends with. Who are you eating with? Who are you doing al-mujalasa? Who are you sitting with? Who are you talking to? Who are you eat? Who are you hanging out with, drinking coffee, calling over the phone, chatting, subscribing to their accounts, liking their videos or whatever it is? Who are you doing that to? That's المجالسة. Can be مجالسة الصالحين or مجالسة أهل البدع والأهواء. What's the difference between the word bid'ah and الهوى? البدعة is an innovation in deen. الهوى is a person that is centered around their desires. Want to hang out, want to go, I don't know, just walking in the mall. What are you doing walking in the mall? I'm just having fun. Okay, how often do you do that? Like once a week or once every 2 weeks, etc. Where are you going? Just walking in the mall just for the sake of walking in the mall? Yeah, just for the sake of walking in the mall. Why are you walking in the mall? What are you doing? Do you have anything that you want to buy? No, I'm just walking in the mall. That's anybody that doesn't have a destination, doesn't have a purpose. That's a problem. And those are different levels. There's that one that is, I guess, just once in a while, once every 6 months, just sometimes just, if I were to walk outside, it's too humid, but I'll just go walk in the mall, probably drink a cup of coffee, maybe eat a cake together, talk about different matters, etc. That's a simple one. But the one that, no, we're just not going to just do that. We're going to be, hey, maybe meeting some people. And you know what I mean? Then you got a problem. You got a big problem. You got teenagers. I don't know why teenage girls would be walking in the malls. Just teenage girls just walking in the mall. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know where their families are, where their families are at to basically just give money or phones to their daughters. 15, 14-year-old girls were just walking in the mall. Why are they walking in the mall? Oh, she's with her friends. What are these girls walking in the mall for? Who are they trying to impress? Who are they trying to expose themselves to? What are they doing? When you have leisure time and you are at that age with lack of maturity, then you can expect so many things to actually be that attraction to them and just go in the wrong direction. And that's why when you look at مجالسة أهل البدع والأهواء, this is a key thing. You got to teach your daughters, you got to teach your sons that there are certain people, they don't belong within your circle. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, at the end, if you were to sit with them, what applies on them as a classification that they're basically fasaq or they're basically muttaqeen or they're salihin, at the end, what applies to them is going to be applied to you. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا, tells them what? If you see these people that would يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا, يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا, whether it's mocking the Quran or whether it's just people that if you were to remind them of Islam, they would be telling you, oh, come on, now you're getting too strict. Look at you, ISIS, making fun of you and putting just different names. These people, you shouldn't be hanging out with them. If they don't have room for learning Islam, they don't have room for even hearing what Islam has to say about this or that, or they're called, oh, here goes the lecturing, oh, here comes the sheikha, or etc., all these different things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَقْعُدْ مَعَهُمْ. Don't even sit with these kind of people. They're not ready to hear Islam. They're not ready to hear an invitation to Jannah. Don't even sit with these people. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, right there, you see these people, you meet these people, they start mocking you, calling you sheikha, or probably mocking you, calling you ISIS, or probably mocking you extremist, etc. These people, that's not the company that you would want. These people, they're definitely a company that with no hesitation, you're going to separate yourself because you come from a completely different mindset. You are, if that's the level that you're at, to the point that people recognize in you, maybe you're just putting yourself with the wrong group. People recognize that you're a person that they'll label you, oh, here comes the sheikha now, and starting to mock you. Oh, here comes ISIS now, and trying to mock you right there. That's basically a sign to tell you that they are telling you that you don't belong with them. They are seeing in you that they're also telling you that you are at a different level. Right now, Islam is becoming your identity. If Islam is your identity, don't be with the people that are struggling with the ABCs of defining even who they are. You're trying to grow in your identity, find a different group. And this is extremely important. And that's why when you see وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الْكِتَابِ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically mentioned that don't sit with these people if they're not taking the religion seriously, not taking the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously, told you, no, الْحَقَ مَنْ جَالَسَهُمْ بِهِمْ. He said, no, those that would sit with them, he considered that they are part of that group. And this is what a group of different scholars had actually said from basically the Muslim Ummah. And at the end, whether hanging out with them or basically entertaining ourselves with them, all of that, you've got different scholars that said the same thing. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Awza'i, Ibn al-Mubarak, they all said, if somebody is sitting with these people, then they're committing that sin basically, because what was supposed to be that commitment to be in was that you were supposed to avoid sitting with these people, and you would basically be considered as adding a number to them. That's why, look at this. Umar bin Abdul Aziz, quite interesting. Umar bin Abdul Aziz had basically, look at this. وقد حمل عمر بن عبد العزيز الحد على مجالسة شربة الخمر وتلا إنكم إذا مثلهم. قيل له فإنه يقول إني أجالسهم لأباينهم وأرد عليهم. قال ينهى عن مجالستهم فإن لم ينتهي ألحق بهم. It's quite interesting. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz had basically ordered that the person that is sitting with a person that is drinking, that they would be punished an equal punishment of the person that was actually drinking himself. Why would you do that? I mean, that was the person drinking. He was the one that was supposed to be punished. Why would you punish the person that was with him? So he said, well, because the ayah said, innakum idhan mithluhum, because the ayah said, you are then like them by sitting and accompanying them. So then he was told, that is Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who was the fifth Khalifa. So what if he were to say, well, I was just sitting with him, basically trying to do da'wah to him? He said, well, he was ordered to avoid him and to not sit with him. If he does not abandon that setting, then they're going to be with them. In other words, if you're a group, I don't know, at a prom, what are you doing at a prom? Well, I'm wearing my hijab. I don't have a boyfriend, but I'm just wearing my hijab. No, you don't belong in that area, period. You don't belong in that area of just walking in malls or probably going to, I don't know, drink, I don't know, just, I don't know, I just love that cheesecake in that casino. What are you doing in that casino? Oh, they have a good steak and they have good cheesecake. Seriously. You're going for that cheesecake and cake and whatever, I don't know, a steak or whatever it is at that casino because, yeah, it's so different. How did you taste that it was different? What were you doing there from the start? How did you know that they had very delicious cheesecake or very good, well done, whatever it is, steak? What were you doing there from the very start? You should not be in that area. If it's a contaminated area, do not sit in that area. Do not be part of adding numbers to these people. Because the second you add numbers to these people, you are a part of them. So you have to go over who are your friends? What are the things that you do together? What are the conversations you hold? What are the jokes? What do those jokes look like? What are the concerns of that person? Then if that concern of that person is of dunya and always dunya, get yourself a new friend. Get yourself a new friend. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. ثم آتينا موسى الكتاب تماما على الذي أحسن وتفصيلا لكل شيء وهدى ورحمة لعلهم بلقاء ربهم يؤمنون وهذا كتاب أنزلناه مبارك فاتبعوه واتقوا لعلكم ترحمون. Let's look at those ayat right there. So now you see, let's take a look at this one really quick. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ. This is my straight path and follow it. And do not follow the paths of those that had went away from the path of the Lord Almighty. That is what the Lord Almighty had taken upon you, so that you may find religious or at least religious integrity. That's tattaqun. And then we had sent upon Musa the revelation as a completion of what was already revealed, and details of everything with guidance, mercy, for they may find their Lord Almighty in belief. And this book, we had revealed it in blessings, so follow it and have religious integrity so that you may find mercy. For you would say, إنما أنزل الكتاب على طائفتين من قبلنا. Well, there was a revelation onto the two different nations before us, yet we were not in full education of them. Or they would say, or you would say, if only we had a revelation upon us, we would have been even more guided than them. So, the Lord Almighty had sent a clarification from your Lord Almighty, guidance and mercy. Whoever would commit transgression and deny the verses of the Lord Almighty and dismisses them, for that way the Lord Almighty will basically punish those that would turn away from our verses of a severe punishment for what they had turned away from. Do they not say? Okay, we're going to stop right there, because then, of course, we're going to be going into another portion of it. That's going to be the last 2 pages. So let's see right there. How is this ayah, ثم آتينا موسى الكتاب تماما على الذي أحسن وتفصيلا لكل شيء وهدى ورحمة لعلهم بلقاء ربهم يؤمنون? How is this related to وأن هذا صراطي مستقيما? So وأن هذا صراطي مستقيما, now this is talking about the path of Islam. So why thumma? Because thumma would mean later. Is that what it means? No. Thumma has several meanings. We're going to talk about thumma and its several meanings. And then آتينا موسى الكتاب. Why did it come back? Why come back to Prophet Musa alayhi salam and say thumma? Okay, now we're going to go zoom out and we're going to go to ayah 91. Okay, I'm going to go back to ayah 91 and actually see what it was saying there. Okay, because remember, the surahs, every single surah is basically coherent and the whole Quran is coherent with one another. Okay, here we go. وما قدر الله حق قدره إذ قالوا ما أنزل الله على بشر من شيء قل من أنزل الكتاب الذي جاء به موسى نورا وهدى للناس تجعلونه قراطيس تبدونها وتخفون كثيرا وعلمتم ما لم تعلموا أنتم ولا آباؤكم قل الله ثم ذرهم في خوضهم يلعبون. So what is this ayah right there in Surah Al-An'am? Remember, it was actually taking us into different groups. It was basically holding a discussion faced at the pagan Arab, and then it was also holding a discussion with the Jews. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that the traces of Tawheed. Remember, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give us the history of Tawheed, give us the history of Islam, that's in order to let us know where we're at in this whole legacy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would then expose that there was a revelation that was sent before, and because the pagan Arab denied that there was any revelation, any trace of any revelation whatsoever, so then the ayah said, well, who's the one that revealed the book that was revealed unto Prophet Musa, that contained the light, that contained the guidance to all people? But then, of course, the Jews were exposing some of it and hiding a lot of it. And then you were basically ignorant of some of that. And then at the end, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically letting them know, هذا كتاب أنزلناه مبارك. This is the Quran that was sent based on the same paradigm that was revealed before, the same legacy. It was confirming that same legacy, that there was a revelation that was basically sent, confirming what was revealed before, and it was to bring about a warning to basically al-Qura, Mecca, and to the cities around it, and it was to announce that those that would believe in the hereafter, they would believe in the revelation, and those that were committed on their salah, and those that would be committed to basically the legislature itself, those were the people that were going to be guided. So now, when it was talking about Prophet Musa alayhi salam, it was bringing in this coherent argument when it was telling the pagan Arabs that, hey, listen, remember that legacy. Okay, well, now that we bring it up for you, and now that you recognize it, now the legacy started out with that tawheed right there, and then later on, of course, it would lay out the different arguments to let them see all the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically brought in terms of different signs, and then it continues to basically telling us about certain legislature, and then it would basically tell us, okay, well, part of that legislature that we told you about was basically taking us into letting us see that trace. And that's when we got to the different rulings that were revealed unto Prophet Musa, the different rulings to include the 10 commandments. And that's how it basically said, okay, now that you recognize that trace of that legislature, that trace of the beginning of that, or at least the revelation in Tawheed that the pagan Arab and different nations were denying. And now that we got to legislature, now we will tell you thumma. That's that thumma right there to tell you, okay, in different legacies, they all go back to the legacy of the prophets and the revelations, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sending that revelation onto all prophets, and the various prophets carrying with it, one, the knowledge about huda, the knowledge about guidance, two, the knowledge is not the knowledge about legislature, how to live that guidance. So that's why it said thumma. In other words, to let you know this isn't necessarily that, yeah, later this is what happened. This isn't the thumma to say later, because there are different types of thumma. All right. This is to also say and so forth. And then, and this is in order to tell us that different paths of what happened. So this isn't to talk about as a chronology, but this is to talk about as a legacy and how it unfolded. ثم آتينا موسى الكتاب تماما على الذي أحسن وتفصيلا لكل شيء. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent upon Musa alayhi salam all the book, since of course before it was talking about the legislation and the 10 commandments. Then that's why it was talking about, well, now that you recognize that whether it's the 10 commandments or whether it was all these different things, that it was all coming from the same torch. وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ. It was coming from the same torch from the time of Prophet Adam to Prophet Nuh to Prophet Musa to Muhammad ibn Abdullah, that it came from the same torch. وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ. That this is the same path that you should follow, and therefore وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا السُّبُلَ, and do not follow the different paths away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the same legacy that it was تماما على الذي أحسن وتفصيلا, it was complete upon those that ahsan. Wait a minute, what do you mean تماما على الذي أحسن? So there are people that were doing good things, and then there was something to complete it. That's one interpretation. We're going to get into the various interpretations for that one, but one of the most beautiful interpretations that I liked is that آتينا موسى الكتاب. Prophet Musa alayhi salam received the scripture, but it would be tamaman, it would be completing على الذي أحسن, those that would live in legacy, or those that would live in piety. This scripture would come in to basically complete all the good things that they were committed to. Let's give an example. A person may be a Christian, but this Christian person was already committed to faith. They were committed. They don't lie. They live by the commandments. They just had a problem with their shirk. It isn't until later that these people had become Muslim. When they had become Muslim, is there a lot that's going to change in their life? No, not a lot is going to change in their life, because they were living to a certain level, the scripture, at least in their commitment. Their commitment didn't drink, didn't, hang out with the wrong people. They were really committed to faith. You look at the nuns and their commitment to faith, even their hijab is beautiful. I'm talking about those that wore the habit and, and that really were committed, all right? And even isolating themselves from dunya, wanting to really live faith and take the time to pray, take the time to go and study the scripture, take the time to be committed, and take the time to basically always live that faith. They didn't do all that entertainment because they were living the faith. So that's a person that was already living faith. Now that they had become Muslim, that person will reach the level of ihsan faster than others. Faster than others. They're expected to let, during our times, we can probably speak about al-A'zami. Al-A'zami was one of the untouchables from the Hindus. All right. He was one of, those that they would, come on social media, these people that would be the Hindus, they would be, dressed looking like I don't know, Gandhi, and they're basically, barely wearing clothes, and they've got these different things that they would put on their forehead, and they would, that's how he was. He was like the guru. Exactly, the untouchables, like the gurus, those, and that's al-Adhami. Al-Adhami was one of these people. He became Muslim. He was from India, became Muslim at around age, was it 24, 25, and then continued with that commitment and went where? Went to Al-Azhar and studied hadith and became one of the most important scholars in hadith. This is تماما على الذي أحسن. For a person that's untouchable, they don't live dunya. They are living in a complete detachment from dunya. That when he became Muslim, he didn't need to add much, but to add, in fact, less commitment, but a different kind of a commitment. And it was a commitment in learning hadith, in learning Islam. And he lived it to this commitment that even a Muslim that was born Muslim did not get to his level of commitment. تماما على الذي أحسن. وتفصيلا لكل شيء. What does the scripture contain? Well, the scripture contained tafsil, contained every detail for each and every single matter. وهدى, guidance, and rahmah. Well, there's a difference between guidance and mercy. لعلهم بلقاء ربهم يؤمنون. Wait a minute, but they're already believers. What do you mean, لعلهم? Is this as a possibility? No. This لعلهم, this is also to tell us, as that part of that inference, is that if a person were to be committed in the details of that guidance and to embrace basically the commitment to receive mercy, that they would be the ones that would have that connection, that they're always thinking of that one day I'm going to be meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they would be so committed to it that they would basically live it wholeheartedly. In what? In al-Iman. So therefore, just as ثم آتينا موسى الكتاب تماما على الذي أحسن, just as those people, they would be basically embracing the scripture that came on to Prophet Musa عليه السلام. That's when the ayah says وهذا كتاب أنزلناه مبارك. Now this is coming in the same pattern, based on the same legacy, based on the same trace, based on the same revelation. وَهَذَا كِتَابٌ, and this is the Quran, and this book is basically coming in the same pattern, in the same trace, in the same paradigm. This Quran takes upon the same path of guidance, the same path of mercy, the same path of faith as the previous Torah had taken, and this is Mubarak. In fact, it is Mubarak, it is blessed. Why Mubarak and not say about Prophet Musa's kitab as Mubarak? Because this one was going to be forever, basically, as the last revelation. It was going to be basically, in terms of timing, when you say something is barakah, in other words, the energy in it, the power in it, the information, the blessing, the force within it is basically lasting longer. It's lasting longer than a specific thing that it was there for. If I were to give you, let's say, a piece of bread, and this piece of bread, it was really enough for just one person, but you managed for you to eat it and your friend and probably your other friend, and you all ate from it. And you all felt that, it gave me the, at least a nourishment. Yes, maybe not full, but the nourishment, it took away my hunger. That's a mubarak. It usually is only enough for just one person, but you did, and you split the barakah, and they all felt that it was, alhamdulillah, that it was actually fulfilling. It went beyond the expected serving. All right. And that's al Mubarak. That this went beyond, not necessarily expected, but it went beyond the timing of the revelation of Prophet Musa alayhi salam's revelation. This was actually going farther in terms of influence, whether in a number of people accepting it, or whether in timing and how long it would stretch basically to be a place of influence, or whether it was in influence in terms of political influence or military influence or probably spiritual influence, etc. It doesn't mean that this one was not containing all of that, but certainly this one exceeded the impact it had on the world. فاتبعوه. So therefore, follow it. وَاتَّقُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. But it's not enough to just follow it, but you have to live that taqwa. What is it, taqwa? الإيمان بالتنزيل والاستعداد ليوم الرحيل. الإيمان بالتنزيل. It's believing in the Quran. It's preparing yourself. والعمل بالتنزيل. الإيمان and العمل. And basically putting that tanzil, basically the Quran, into action. والاستعداد ليوم الرحيل. And it's preparing yourself for the day of completing the journey, death. That's taqwa. So when you say وَاتَّقُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, yes, فَاتَّبِعُوا, be committed, but at the same time, go to the level of that you want to guard this identity of Iman, of Islam, like you would guard your own personal self. Yes, take Islam personal. Take Islam as your identity. If Islam is attacked, take it as if you are the one being attacked. That's what taqoo, that it's you. This is your identity. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. That's what would increase the chances of you embracing and being included in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. So this is it for today because of Salatul Jumu'ah. Inshallah, if there are any questions, the untouchables, yes, in India. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. Love those questions that you guys would ask, mashallah. Very, very much love those questions that many of you, mashallah, it just reflects very intelligent sisters attending the classes. So if you would like to unmute yourselves, go ahead. All right.